So, good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you at this joint academic event organized by the Lithuanian Comparative Literature Association in cooperation with the Vilnius University Faculty of Philology and the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. And this is one of the events dedicated to celebrate the youthful anniversary of our Association for Comparative Literature, the 20th anniversary. This association is really very energetic, has great academic events, thanks to our chair, Dr. Karolina Bagdone, and the previous chair, Laura Laurushaite. And this is one of the examples of the creativity, I think, because we are really happy to have a very special guest, Professor Ben Hutchinson, who is a director of the University of London Institute in Paris and professor of European literature. He was previously professor of European literature and director of a graduate and research college at the University of Kent, and also led the Paris School of Arts and Culture. Professor Hutchinson's research interests include German literature, comparative literature, and essayistic nonfiction, which I think also resonates very well with researchers of Lithuanian literature because of the importance of essayistic writing in our comparative literary field. And Ben Hutchinson is the author of several books, among them Comparative Literature, a very short introduction. I think this book is known very well to our researchers and it has been quoted. And also several other books, The Midlife Mind, Literature and the Art of Aging, published in 2020, a collection of essays on reading literature, On Purpose, 10 Lessons on the Meaning of Life, and also Lateness and Modern European Literature, exploring the ways in which European literature defines itself through a sense of belatedness and epigonality. So a very interesting spectrum of comparative topics and theoretical reflections on the field of comparative literature. Professor Hutchinson has held fellowships from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, has received the Philip Leverhelm Prize and Forum for Modern Languages Prize, and he's also a fellow of the Academia Europaea and a contributing editor at the wonderful Times Literary Supplement. Also, I would like to mention that Professor Hutchinson gave an interview before coming to Vilnius. It appeared a week ago at 15 Minutes internet site and also at the site of Comparative Literature Association. A great, very interesting interview, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do that. So, have I forgotten to mention something?
Too much.
I hope not. So I'm really pleased to invite Professor Ben Hutchinson to deliver a lecture from European origins to globalization, comparison, and its discontents. And the lecture will be followed by our discussion.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you above all for the kind invitation, above all to you, Carolina, for making this happen. I'm delighted to be here with you, all the more so given that I almost wasn't here with you. It's amazing that this lecture starts at 5 and I was here, I think, 4 minutes late. I had to go fly from Paris via, I won't bore you with the details, Paris via Amsterdam, long delays. I'm very pleased to be here with you. It's always a relief when one arrives. And of course, it's not every day that one gets the opportunity to visit a city one doesn't know, to make new friends and discover new ideas and new perspectives on our shared European culture. So, I mean, this really makes me conscious of, I think it's true of anyone who's a comparatist. We have broad interests by definition, but we also are aware of how limited our broad interests are necessarily, because we're all finite human beings. And so I come here conscious of my own limitations in a spirit of humility, all too aware of how little I know about Lithuanian culture and literature. And I look forward to hearing and learning from all of you. And I'm particularly intrigued by what you just said already about the essayistic tradition. I'd like to hear more about that. So I don't stand before you with predetermined answers. What I do hope to raise, though, are certain questions. Questions that concern all of us, in as much as we share a common interest in the possibilities and parameters of comparative literature. What I want to ask are the possibilities and parameters of comparative literature. Well, comparison is central to all kinds of intellectual inquiry. It's through comparison that categories emerge, that distinctions take shape, and that the boundaries of scholarly objects are drawn. One might even say that it's the human condition to think comparatively. Our very ability to communicate, our common vernacular, is itself constructed comparatively, as Dante indicates in his famous Manifesto de Vulgare Eloquentia, when he notes that since comparisons can only be made on the basis of the culmination of merit that we call worthiness, it's plain that degrees of worthiness, greater and lesser, can only be established by comparing them with each other. So since the vernacular I call illustrious is the best of all vernaculars, it follows that only the best subjects are worthy to be discussed in it. So our so-called vulgar languages, the vernaculars that we all speak, are a consequence to that extent of comparison. But of course, we've also become increasingly aware of the ways in which comparison distorts communication. Comparison, to cite the blurb of one recent workshop I attended, and I think it's representative of a pretty standard position nowadays. Comparison is often entangled with practices of inclusion and exclusion, raising questions about whose knowledge is legitimized, what is rendered comparable, and how boundaries between disciplines, traditions, and histories are drawn. We've come a long way from 19th century naivety, from the belief in comparison as a value-free project, innocent of power struggles and cultural projections. Where does this leave us? Well, exploring the balance between these two extremes, between the scylla of absolute belief in the analytic power of comparison on the one hand, and the charybdis of absolute dismissal of its compromised perspectives on the other, is, I think, the defining challenge of comparative literature in the 21st century. In support of this aim, and to give us what I hope will be a hopeful framework within which to calibrate this balance, I'd like to offer you today 3 movements in the key of comparison. How do I get the slides to work? Is it this one?
I think so.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin with some general thoughts on what we take ourselves to be doing when we compare. And then I'm going to move on to a more historically conditioned, historically contingent analysis of our disciplinary modes of comparison. And then once I've outlined these epistemological and historical perspectives, I'll then turn to an analytical perspective to suggest what I am increasingly coming to see, at least in my own mind, as a way beyond the disciplinary trap of too much comparison. So, first of all, what does it mean to compare? Well, as we know, few books have had an impact as far-reaching as that of Edward Said's Orientalism. For better or worse, Said's epoch-making study revolutionized how we see West-Eastern relations, creating an army of post-colonial culture warriors. Asia, in all its immensity, was no longer to be understood as a mere geographical marker, but as a cultural concept, an exotic other projected, and thus distorted, onto the canvas of Western fantasies. Identity, Said showed us, was in the eye of the beholder. Beyond any single aspect of his much contested argument, one of the key consequences of Said's work has been to render all methodological terminology potentially suspect. If Orientalism suggests the distorting effects of cultural construction, might this not also be true of other areas and of other isms? Arcticism, for instance, Caribbeanism, Balticism. Methodology, we've learned, is not a neutral prism. The view from one part of the world onto another is never entirely disinterested. We're all standing somewhere. The study of comparative literature is subject to the same distorting pressures, it seems to me, as the study of the Orient. In fact, I'd go further. It's not just subject to such pressures, it's defined by them, by the attempt to reflect on, to write about, and to do justice to the ricocheting reactions of one culture to another. Comparativism, as one might term it, in analogy to Orientalism, is anything but disinterested. It constructs its critique in the process of comparing, or rather, it inherits it, building on deep foundations of historical, cultural, and geographical judgment. As with Said's Orientalism, the cornerstone of this construction is in Europe is West-Eastern, perhaps also North-Southern paternalism. But it's far from the only building block. Other obstacles include predetermining views of genre, of medium, even of language. There's little, in fact, that is not grist to the will of Western educated critics. As comparatists, we're all beholden to our own preconceptions, our own prejudices, if you like, to speak with Hans-Georg Gadamer. So I, like everyone else, begin, as I have to, from somewhere. So in the spirit of full disclosure, here's my disclaimer. I come from somewhere specific, which in my case is the heart of the Western European tradition. I've come to you directly from Paris, as was just announced. I direct the University of London's Institute in Paris. So in many ways, it's barely possible to represent a more compromised colonial imperial position than there's two colonial capitals, Paris and London. I can attempt to overcome my education through further education, through provincializing Europe, in Dipesh Chakrabarty's much-cited term, and through learning to see the world from elsewhere. I can write, as you know, a very short introduction to comparative literature, invoking an age of global south and realigned peripheries, identifying Eurocentrism as the great fear of contemporary criticism in an age of post-colonial globalization. But what I cannot do, any more than anyone else, is rewrite my own origin or my own upbringing. What I cannot do, even supposing I wanted to, is erase my own education, Eurocentric as it is. In the words of the old joke, when asked for directions, I wouldn't start from here. But of course, I can only start from here. That's the point of the joke. I can only judge any future experience in contrast to those that I've already had. However hard I may strive to look beyond the limitations of my own life experience, I cannot unlearn, nor would I necessarily want to unlearn decades of acculturation. None of our conceptions are immaculate. We're all contingent creatures of circumstance. We're always already compromised. Well, writ large, such a paradox describes the position of comparative literature in the 21st century. The history of the discipline as it developed in the global north, and the dominance, one has to say, of the discipline as it's developed in the global north, means that our approach to comparison is ineluctably predetermined. Centuries of power structures press upon our attempts to resist them in different ways depending on where we stand. The emergence of comparative approaches to languages in the colonial projects of British India or French North Africa, to give the two examples of the world I come from, the evolution of what I would call competitive approaches to culture. Comparative literature is also competitive literature, particularly in those nation-building projects in the 19th century. The pathos of exile as a driving force, both physically and metaphysically, of the mid-20th century consolidation of the discipline, especially as we know amongst Jewish scholars fleeing the Second World War. All these moments and more constitute, for better or worse, the contemporary comparatist's inheritance. Or such at least is the view from the West. I'll come back to that term. An Eastern or Southern comparatist could, at least in principle, tell a different story about the development of comparative approaches to culture, uninfluenced by a Western Northern narrative. Africans, to cite the late Ngugi Wa argument in Decolonizing the Mind, do not need Europeans to tell them how to think. Asians did not require the arrival of European colonialists to show them the importance, let's say for the early modern period, of a lingua franca like Sanskrit. We still have much to learn, I think, about the multifaceted, multipolar history of our discipline. I think we still lack, so to speak, a comparative history of comparative literature. Parallels between Western and Eastern spheres of influence are certainly not lacking. The importance of having numerous competing languages within a circumscribed cultural area is common to the emergence of comparative literature in both Europe and India, for instance, roughly the same number of languages in both continents, while the structural role of empire is shared by both West and East. Eastern comparative methodologies are no more innocent of power struggles than their Western counterparts. Whatever the merits of dividing comparative cultures into monolithic blocks in this manner, simply replacing East with West, West with East, North with South is hardly going to recalibrate our critical compasses. The question that emerges from this juxtaposition is whether comparativism constructs itself diversely in diverse circumstances, or whether its prejudices remain essentially the same despite the changing details of time and place. It's a matter, in other words, of the old comparative contrast between similarity and difference. Is there, in the final analysis, a limited number of methodological moves? Well, a provisional way of answering this might be to say that comparative literature, excuse me, I brought a cold with me, is pre-positioned. I mean this literally, which is to say grammatically. We work on French or English or Lithuanian literature, but we say that we work in comparative literature, since it's a field or a discipline rather than a body of material. What this means in practice, thank you, is that questions of theory or methodology are disproportionately important, since in many ways comparative literature is a question of theory or methodology. Like few other disciplines in the humanities, comparative literature is obsessed with its own theoretical framework, to the point where much contemporary comparativism might more accurately be termed comparative literature theory. I've been guilty of this myself. Comparison is more theorized than practiced very often. Like a graduate school militia, it staggers from skirmish to skirmish in a state of constant civil war over its own basic premises. To say that this makes comparative literature a second-order discourse understates the case. As the corpses of dead and decaying theories pile up on top of each other, comparative literature flees ever further into third, fourth, and fifth-order levels of self-consciousness. All literary criticism, to be sure, is writing about writing, but comparison is writing about writing about writing. And pieces like this lecture I'm giving to you now, comparative theory about comparative approaches to comparative literature, operate at 3 or 4 removes from any original work of art or text. So the potential for infinite regress is vertiginous. Such then is a basic fact, an a priori fact, if you like, about comparativism. It's a machine for self-reflection, constantly turning back on itself in ever more intricate coils of comment and contextualization. One of the earliest disciplinary statements already suggests as much. The French critic Philibert Schall, in his inaugural lecture of 1835 entitled Littérature étrangère comparée, suggests that the aim of the discipline should be to calculate the influence of thought upon thought. Susan Bassnett, who cites this passage in her influential Introduction to Comparative Literature of 1993, and she's currently the president of the British Comparative Literature Association, I should say. Susan Bassnett suggests that a key word in this text, in that sentence, is influence. But I think one might equally make a case for the preposition upon, understood as the marker of both mutual interaction, this perpetual exchange upon the individual nationalities, and epistemological recursion. The critic Schall adds his thought upon thought upon thought, as does Susan Bassnett, and as now do I. There's always another turn of the comparative screw. Dangers of this are obvious, I think. If the observer effect, the possibility that the act of observation may affect what is observed, risks distorting our relationship to all artistic processes, the comparer effect risks distorting our relationship, among other things, to ourselves. So we're constantly second-guessing our own motives. We're constantly worrying over the ways in which we do and do not, should and should not compare. It's the reason for these sorts of lectures in many ways. I think this is the driving force and perhaps to some extent the paradox of national comparative literature associations, such as the one we're gathered here today. And I should add, by the way, that this is the 20th anniversary of your association. It's also this year the 50th anniversary of the British Comparative Literature Association, and a happy coincidence. But one might wonder whether national comparative associations are not a kind of oxymoron, But there is at the least, I think, an interesting tension. What is Lithuanian comparative literature as opposed to, say, French or German comparative literature or English comparative literature? I suppose it has to mean comparing against a given set of historical and cultural, perhaps also regional and political circumstances, in a way that foregrounds the perspective produced by these circumstances as a kind of privileged epistemology. But it's one of the lessons of the discipline's history that comparative literature, as I said earlier, has always also been competitive literature, at least within the European sphere. This is another way of saying that whilst the act of observing may alter the object, the act of comparing alters the comparer, inasmuch as she is forced to reflect on the presuppositions underlying her comparing, and then on the presuppositions underlying those presuppositions, and so on. Wherever it's based, whatever its inherited tradition, comparativism is defined by self-consciousness. No wonder we seem to be in a permanent state of crisis or identity crisis in our discipline. The most obvious way in which comparativism is very far from neutral is in its geopolitical bias. One obvious example of this, I think, and it will probably be known to lots of you, is Hugo Melzer's so-called principle of polyglottism, which he defined in his editorial to the very first issue of the first, what I believe is the first journal of comparative literature, Acta Comparationis, in 1877. Here is a somewhat out of focus image of that first issue. And what's interesting for those of you who don't know this story is that he and his collaborator decided they were going to launch this journal, and it was going to be available to people publishing in 10 different languages. Which, as you can, it's not surprised then, when you know that, it's not surprised that the journal only lasted 10 years, because it must have been impossible to make it work, pragmatically speaking. But what's interesting about those 10 official languages, well, here they are. And what jumps out, of course, is that they're all European. And also that Russia is not there. He made a point of excluding Russia for reasons that were political, but also, interestingly, he justified this on formal stylistic grounds, saying that what interested him was in the Germanic idea of Kunstliteratur rather than Volksliteratur, and that Russia only produced the latter, according to this polemical position, and therefore was not worthy of being considered in this context. And the other thing he wanted to establish was that comparison, Vergleichung, was a way of pushing back against what he saw as nationalist narratives about literary history. Particularly if you think of the 19th century, he was writing in a largely Germanic context. He was thinking of Gervinus and his literary history of the German-speaking world, and that they took this to be a nationalist project, and he wanted to push back explicitly against nationalism through the project of comparison, through the project of comparative literature. But of course, within this very, let's say, Western Euro-centric world, I should add here that the term West, we can perhaps pick this up later in the discussion. Interesting, I had a very interesting talk on this just a few weeks ago, and I've learned from a book that's just appeared called The West with Princeton, is that the term was essentially defined by Auguste Comte in the 1840s and 1850s. This may not be news to you, it was news to me, in Paris, as a way of excluding Russia, explicitly as a way of excluding Russia. So I think this is interesting in this context too, the way these nationalists and these politics plays into these supposedly philological decisions. Meltzer notoriously wrote that Asian literature could be accepted when it finally comes round to using our alphabet. That was his famous statement about this. So the idea that comparative literature should acquire a more global vision, an idea, of course, that recurs throughout the history of the discipline, is itself, we can see this with other examples too, paradoxically local, since it presupposes a Western or Northern core beyond which the discipline should develop. So we've been struggling, I think, to escape this center and peripheries model ever since. So comparative literature, as it's developed in Europe, works backwards from effects to causes. Non-Western constructs, Far East, Global South, are seen from Western perspectives. While we in the West seem to retain our rights to define our own identity, to conceptualize and legitimize ourselves on our own terms, no such right is extended, as we see it, to other areas of the world, which must await the approval of the international community, which of course mostly means the English language community, with bated breath. The famous Greenwich meridian of comparison remains very much a European latitude. But it's equally clear, I think it'll be clear to all of us, that in the last few decades, let's say since the start of the new millennium, if not earlier, comparative literature has been defined by its attempt to establish new terms for new times. For all their differences, terms such as world literature, planetary literature, global literature, corresponding to the gathering forces of post-colonialism, environmentalism, and globalization, share a common desire to reconfigure what we might call the Western paradigm. It's worth reflecting briefly on the precise nature of this paradigm. At one level, the move beyond Eurocentrism marks a disciplinary development very much in line with the pattern that Thomas Kuhn famously outlined in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. In the case of comparative literature, one could say that the collapse of European colonialism, occasioned by World War II, led the discipline to correct itself into a new course of action, a new set of shared beliefs, in Thomas Kuhn's terms. For such a paradigm shift to have been possible, it must have been preceded by a previous set of beliefs, namely in the power of comparison to open up new angles on literature and culture in the first place. Comparative literature, that is to say, is already a paradigm. A paradigm is prerequisite to perception itself, in Kuhn's terms, a description that neatly captures the comparative epistemology as we know it. In his postscript of 1969, his postscript to this extremely influential book, Kuhn distinguishes between local and global paradigms. And this distinction might, I think, usefully be applied to the transition from Eurocentric to world literature, from a local to a global paradigm. What I'm trying to say is we need to acknowledge the paradigmatic quality of comparison tout court before we acknowledge the paradigmatic shifts within it. I'm not going to rehearse the characteristics of this paradigm shift today, since much has already been written about them. What I want to highlight, however, is the change in adjectival emphasis, the common attempt to move the discourse away from the methodology of comparison and towards the field of its purview. World literature, planetary literature, global literature. All of those most recent, all these prominent recent alternatives to comparative literature are conceived as challenging rather than celebrating their own premises, as questioning what it means to speak of international literature as much as how to create it or to criticize it. Comparative literature in the 21st century is born skeptical. So I'm going to come to my second movement now, and think about how, now that we've established comparativism as its own kind of paradigm with all the prejudices and presuppositions that this implies, the most basic of which, of course, is that comparison is a worthwhile thing to do in the first place, I'm going to move on to think about what defines our disciplinary modes of comparison. Recent coinages such as planetary or global literature notwithstanding, there have historically been two main disciplinary terms for the intercultural, interlinguistic approach to literary studies: comparative literature and world literature. The latter term has seen a surge in the last 25 years or so with studies, I'm sure they're very familiar to you, by the likes of David Damrosch, Pascal Casanova, and Emily Apter, famously against world literature, achieving quasi-canonical status. But of course, world literature has its own conceptual history, and it's one that tracks in interesting ways alongside the history of comparative literature. So in this second movement, I propose to reflect on the history of the two terms over the longue durée, and in particular on their emergence in the 19th century. Well, it's hardly an exaggeration, I think, to say that in the period before, during, and after 1800, comparison emerged as the defining methodology of the human sciences. I'll just give you a few examples of this. Writing just a little over a century ago in the founding editorial of the Revue de littérature comparée in 1921, Fernand Baldensberger identified a handful of precursors in the 18th century before noting the rapid rise at the beginning of the 19th century in forms of comparative methodology. So he gives some examples. La mythologie comparée avec l'histoire, l'histoire comparée des systèmes de philosophie, même l'érotique comparée, whatever that is. And this then culminated in the first, what we think is the first published use of the term in this context, the Cours de littérature comparée, published in 1816. These were two of Napoleon's savants that he took with him to Egypt, to North Africa. So the era of comparative literature, as we can see, had begun by the start of the 19th century. What had also begun shortly afterwards, and really around the same time, broadly speaking, was the era of world literature. While comparative literature emerged as a discipline in modern European discourse of the early 19th century, world literature, or of course, Weltliteratur in the canonical Goethean formulation, emerged as a discursive term only shortly afterwards in Goethe's formation of 1827. And of course, then it was picked up by Marx and Engels and all sorts of other people afterwards. So the question I want to ask is, what was the relationship between the two, and why did they develop, the two terms, comparative and world literature, and why did they develop where and when they did? My provisional answer to this question is that we should understand the terms not, as often tends to happen, as socio-political categories driven by market forces of circulation and translation, but rather as rhetorical categories determined by their own internal logic. What, I want to ask, is their normative power as terms? To what extent does their rhetorical structure predetermine their parameters, to come back to the word I used at the start of this lecture? Well, to help think about this, I'm going to turn to someone that may well be familiar to you, namely Roman Jakobson and his famous essay, Two Aspects of Language, Two Types of Aphasic Disturbance, published in 1956. It'll become clear why I'm doing this. Jakobson makes a number of rhetorical moves in his essay, but the most celebrated is his distinction between the two poles of metaphoric and metonymic language, of metaphor and metonymy. The motor of metaphor, Jakobson reminds us, is similarity. One thing is like another. The motor of metonymy, on the other hand, is contiguity. One thing is next to or part of another. So I'm going to suggest that Jakobson's distinction maps instructively onto the mechanisms of comparative and world literature, where the former compares one text to another, the latter, world literature, situates one text within the global or semantic field of others. For comparison to be possible, at least initially, the things being compared must stand apart. To claim the status of world literature for a given work, conversely, is to make it a synecdoche of a broader whole, a part of a broader whole. So comparative and world literature may be said to function as a kind of mobile army of metaphors and metonymies. Now, you may recognize that phrase, and because I've stolen it from a famous essay by Nietzsche, written in 1873. The essay is entitled Über Wahrheit und Lüge im außermoralischen Sinne. And in this essay, Nietzsche holds that truth is rhetorical. As he says, eine Summe von menschlichen Relationen, die poetisch und rhetorisch gesteigert, übertragen, geschmuckt wurden. What I want to show by analogy is that disciplinary truth is rhetorical, constructed as it is on a vocabulary that may initially be fresh, but that over time hardens into barely perceptible dogma and doxa, just like, again, what Nietzsche calls metaphors that have become worn out and powerless, coins that have lost their image. The only way to reinvigorate these terms is to re-examine their historical premises, to turn the rhetorical force of fossilized vocabulary back against itself. To paraphrase Nietzsche, Jakobson's terms can help us remember that disciplinary truths are ideologies about which it has been forgotten that they're ideologies. So here then are the terms that Jakobson uses in his opposition, and how I'm going to suggest we might apply them to comparative and to world literature. Give you a chance to look at those. I'll leave them up on the screen for a moment, don't worry, as I talk through them. To follow this set of oppositions through the opening decades of the 19th century is to witness the emergence of comparative and world literature as disciplinary categories, with all the implications that this has for us, their heirs, 2 centuries later. No one's listening to me because you're all taking photos of the screen behind me. Perhaps I should just give you a moment. If the initial opposition between metaphor and metonymy dictates all the subsequent terms, and that is the case in the essay, it's because their interplay is fundamental to any mode of hermeneutic understanding. Aristotle famously privileged metaphor, declaring it the true mark of genius and ensuring its enduring preeminence by elevating it in his Poetics to the status of a master trope. But by the time of the 20th century, formalist and structuralist critics had re-established metonymy as metaphors, rhetorical or other, drawn as they were to this structure of binary oppositions. In Jakobson's words, a competition between both devices, metonymic and metaphoric, is manifest in any symbolic process. And I think the comparative process is no exception to this. Where the distinction becomes particularly interesting is in the stylistic characteristics that you can see Jakobson ascribes to the two poles. So again, he doesn't. I'm adding comparative and world literature at the top. This is not his argument. It's my argument. I'm just using his terms to draw out the distinctions. But these are his distinctions. So metaphoric writing, Jakobson claims, is essentially romantic and poetic. Realist writing, on the other hand, metonymic writing, on the other hand, is essentially realist and prosaic. It's my contention then that relationship between these two models of comparative and world literature in the early 19th century as they were emerging corresponds, broadly speaking, to this pattern. Comparative literature emerges out of the romantic aspiration around 1800 to find what Friedrich Schlegel termed die Quelle aller Sprachen, the source of all languages. World literature emerges in 1827, as we know, right at the start of the realist period that Hegel famously termed the age of prose. Romantic literature functions through comparison. One need only think of the preponderance of similes, all the as if, als ob, comme si, plus subjunctive constructions that you find in paradigmatic romantic writers such as Wordsworth, Eichendorff, or Musset. Realist literature posits a world in which the protagonist attempts to find his or her place. You think of the typical model of the Bildungsroman. So those are the two oppositions. And I think as models of transnationalism, the two terms comparative literature and world literature mirror the aesthetic developments of the 19th century into their very grammar. Because to say that comparative literature emerges out of the spirit of romanticism is to say that it inherits a whole set of discursive assumptions. And of course, it did very much emerge out of the moment of European romanticism, historically speaking, in terms of the chronology. Chief among these assumptions is the notion that language is vitally metaphorical. Those are the words of perhaps the most romantic of all manifestos, namely Shelley's Defense of Poetry. And Shelley writes that the language marks the before unapprehended relation of things. This relation of things is, of course, precisely what the comparative critic sets out to apprehend, seeking, as we do, to defamiliarize literature through fresh comparisons, just as the romantic poet seeks to defamiliarize life through fresh formulations. Such a process for the comparatist is necessarily predicated on absence, on the idea that meaning or further meaning can only be disclosed through triangulation, a kind of variation on the Hegelian dialectic, the tension between the thesis and the antithesis of two separate texts, as we compare them, produces the synthesis of insight, of the comparative insight, the comparative payoff, if you like. It doesn't already exist. It's not pre-existing. It's contingent on our subjective perspective as a comparatist. We produce that insight by comparing things. Such a way of thinking mirrors the process of the subject discovering itself that drives the emergence of romanticism. I mean, what ultimately underpins the romantic epiphany is, of course, some kind of guarantee of God or some kind of absolute. But even short of this, the defining enthusiasms of the romantic sensibility, love, art, the sublime, they're all predicated on self-transcendence, on the notion that the individual has to surpass itself in order to gain access to a finer grained apprehension. So absence precedes presence. So it's not a historical coincidence, I'm trying to say, that comparative literature emerged as a discipline at the height of romanticism. Not least, of course, because it originally did so in many of its models as comparative philology. I say this in the Faculty of Philology. The story's a familiar one, at least from the perspective of the cultures with which I'm mostly familiar. As colonialism opened up whole new continents for fieldwork, comparisons between modern European and ancient Oriental languages became inevitable. Based on the experiences, to cite a well-known example, in British India, an Orientalist such as Sir William Jones in the late 18th century argued that European and Asiatic languages shared common roots in that individual language known as Proto-Indo-European. Poetry in particular served as the basis for the argument. Jones and his followers suggested analogies between the classical Asian languages of Persian and Sanskrit and the classical European languages of Latin and Greek. And their colonial fieldwork became the basis for subsequent theories of European Romanticism to dream of finding Schlegel's source of all languages through what he termed vergleichende Grammatik. And here it is. Jener entscheidende Punkt, der hier alles aufhellen wird, ist die innere Struktur der Sprachen oder die vergleichende Grammatik, comparative grammar, which will give us completely new insights into the genealogy of languages in a manner analogous to the way in which comparative anatomy has illuminated a higher history of nature. Here we can hear again the backstory of other modes of comparison in the sciences in the 19th century. So in these early days of the discipline, comparative grammar was to be something like Casaubon's key to all mythologies, those of you who've read Middlemarch. If comparative literature describes a technique or methodology, world literature, on the other hand, describes a field. Its metonymic logic is that of a part pointing towards a whole, which explains its emergence as an attempt to transcend national modes of thinking. The methodology of comparative literature is predicated upon identifying national traits, since otherwise they cannot be compared, whereas world literature gestures, however, inconclusively, towards a universal totality akin to Schiller's idea of universal history. Yet it does so, of course, from a necessarily partial perspective, as I was saying earlier, principally by expanding on a pre-existing European way of seeing the world. Goethe himself wrote of, Goethe didn't just write of Weltliteratur, he wrote of europäische, das heißt Weltliteratur. And of course, in fact, the term, as we know, predates Goethe. We always speak of Goethe as having coined it, but other people used the term before him. The historian Schlözer in 1773, in reference to Icelandic sagas, Wieland in sometime in the last decade of the 18th century, in reference to Roman urbanity. And of course, Goethe himself insists famously, for all his expansive gestures towards Chinese or Serbian, that if we really want a pattern, we must always return to the ancient Greeks. So the perspective of the critic, to return to my first movement, always predetermines the perspective of what's being discussed. But I want to make a more fundamental point still today. Comparative literature, as these few thoughts I hope make clear, is always already conceived from the point of view of the critic. It's not just that critics would always necessarily have their prejudices and their predetermined positions. It's that the whole discipline of comparative literature is only ever conceived, or at least the vast majority of the time in my experience, as a critical discipline. It's always we, the critics, who are doing the comparing, and the texts or the authors who are being compared. What would it mean, I want to ask, to reconceive comparative literature as comparative literature? Such is going to be my question of the third and final movement of this lecture. Comparative literature is a matter of critical judgment. We agonize over how we should and should not compare. We ask each other on occasions such as this, whether one theory or methodology is more acceptable intellectually, politically, ethically than another. The answers change with the times, but one constant always remains: the belief that we, the critics, are the ones doing the comparing. Comparative critics are the subject, and literature is the object. But what would it mean to invert this perspective? What would it mean to propose a kind of revolution in perspective in which literature does not revolve around us, but we around it? For too long, I think, or I mean, I speak for myself, I have taken for granted the idea that comparative literature is a second-order discipline, a second-order discourse. But might we reconceive it as a first-order discourse, such that it's the writers themselves doing the comparing rather than being compared? So this is the question I want to ask. This is what I mean by, is it possible to compare too much? Is it possible for we as critics to impose ourselves too much on the literature? Understood in this way, the history of comparative literature as a discipline might look quite different. Discipline would no longer begin, as it's generally taken to do, as indeed I took it in my very short introduction, around the turn of the 19th century, but would rather find its origins, let's say, in antiquity, for the simple reason, of course, that understood in this way, comparative literature is simply literature. What I want to suggest, in other words, is that the tools of the comparatist, such as we know them, are always already applied by authors themselves. Comparative writers in this regard have no need of comparative critics. And indeed, it's one of my aims in proposing this model to make myself as a critic as small as possible, if you like. This kind of humility, I think, really behooves us all. We can never entirely avoid the observer effect I described earlier, but we can try to minimize our own projections, our own distortions of all those poor texts that never asked anything of us. The trick in doing so is to ask how writers themselves function as comparatists. To read is to compare, in the celebrated formulation of George Steiner that I quote, in fact, on the cover of that book. But so is to write. There are many examples I could take from the history of literature to illustrate this basic point, since comparison is essentially a precondition of creation. For the purposes of concluding this lecture, however, I'll limit myself to just 3 deliberately canonical examples from 3 major traditions. The obvious place to start, given his central role in launching the idea of Weltliteratur, is with the foundational German poet Goethe. Goethe provides a paradigmatic example of a writer who became a locus classicus of comparative theory, particularly, of course, through the idea of world literature. What's striking, though, is that he's much less often understood through his comparative practice. And yet, of course, he compares everywhere in his writings, in his novels, as well as in his poems, and indeed his plays. I'll just cite the celebrated lines from his Roman elegies, the römische Elegien. Dann verstehe ich den Marmor erst recht. Ich denk und vergleiche. Sehe mit fühlendem Aug, fühle mit sehender Hand. This is often cited, very famous lines, often cited as an illustration of Goethe's synesthetic imagination, the eye that feels and the hand that sees. But these lines also illustrate his comparative way of thinking. I think and compare. Compareo ergo sum. It's perhaps in relation to the concept of Bildung, that quintessentially Germanic concept, that Goethe is most characteristically comparative. Whilst I could identify in his work several categories of comparative reflection, epistemological, existential, aesthetic, erotic, it's as a moral category centered around the idea of Bildung that comparison emerges most forcefully in Goethe's novels, and for good reason. With the 2 volumes of Wilhelm Meister, Goethe famously created the Bildungsroman, more or less. One could cite several passages in which Bildung is conceived comparatively in the novel. After all, it's not just the protagonist who's being gebildet or formed, but also the author and by extension the reader. But I'll limit myself to just one example taken from the Wanderjahr. So we could answer the question of whether or not one should compare when considering artistic achievements as follows. The educated connoisseur should compare, for he has the idea in mind. He has grasped the concept of what can and should be achieved. The amateur, on the path to education, develops best when he does not compare, but considers each achievement individually. In this way, feeling and a sense for the more general are gradually developed. The comparison of the ignorant is really just a convenience to forego judgment. Leaving aside the implications of this for our university structures and whether a comparison is something that should be happening at an undergraduate, at a postgraduate level, and so on, and I think there are some interesting implications here, what becomes clear is that Goethe thinks in a comparative way, but he also compares in a thinking way, reflecting on the limits and preconditions of comparison. For advanced aesthetes, as you can see, he advocates comparison almost in Platonic terms, since in comparing one work of art with another, these advanced thinkers can hope to access the idea of complete artistic realization behind all of them. But for less advanced thinkers, what he calls amateurs on their way to Bildung, these less advanced thinkers for Goethe are better advised considering each work on its own terms, in isolation, as a means of training their sensibility. Untrained comparison, as Goethe sees it, serves as a way of avoiding rather than aiding true aesthetic judgment. Another way of saying this is to say that the connoisseur should compare, but only at the end of the process of education, only once she is ausgebildet. Here we have it, der ausgebildete Kenner soll vergleichen. One is not born a comparatist, to paraphrase Simone de Beauvoir, one becomes one. The moral as well as aesthetic overtones are unmistakable. To be able to compare is a mark of distinction, since it implies command both of a body of material and of one's own critical faculties. Comparison to this extent is not just of the work of art, it's also of the various stages of the self as they progress through the phases of Bildung. As Antonio tells Tasso in Goethe's play of that name, vergleich dich, erkenne, was du bist. There's much more I could say about Goethe's engagement with ideas of comparison, not least, of course, regarding his own application of his view of world literature in his West Eastern Divan. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, or rather back to my second example, namely the most canonical of all authors, Shakespeare. Shakespeare barely writes a line without comparing. It's no surprise that there are so many analogies in the sonnets. Skillful use of simile is one of the foundations of lyric poetry. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? What's more surprising, however, is that there should be so many meta-reflections on the nature of comparison in Shakespeare's work, as for instance here in Troilus and Cressida. I'll just read this passage out. True swains in love shall in the world to come approve their truths by Troilus, when their rhymes, full of protest, of oath and big compare, want similes, truth tired with iteration, as true as steel, as plantage to the moon, as sun to day, as turtle to her mate, as iron to adamant, as earth to the center, yet, after all comparisons of truth, as truth's authentic author to be cited, as true as Troilus, shall crown up the verse and sanctify the numbers. The standard similes of love poetry that one encounters in the sonnets take on a kind of meta twist here. Troilus is now no longer just another lyric poet comparing his mistress to the sun or to the moon. He's become the very arbiter of truth, a status achieved through transcending the arbitrary nature of given specific comparisons and becoming the guarantor of any comparison. That this is achieved through a series of similes, an anaphora of analogies, merely serves to reinforce the point. All those lines beginning as. After all these comparisons of truth, the final one, which is in inverted commas in the text, as true as Troilus, clinches the claim. Through comparison, Troilus, or we might suggest Shakespeare, becomes truth's authentic author. It's the poet who compares, not the critic. Something not altogether dissimilar, albeit in a very different context, takes place in my final example. After the canonical German and English poets, I turn to the canonical French poet of modernity, Baudelaire. Baudelaire's correspondence have long been a touchstone of symbolist poetry, but the extent to which they're predicated on what we might think of as comparison is less often remarked. So this is the sonnet, which I'll just read out and share a few thoughts, and then I'll conclude. La nature est un temple où de vivants piliers laissent parfois sortir de confuses paroles. L'homme y passe à travers des forêts de symboles qu'il observe avec des regards familiers. Comme de longs échos qui de loin se confondent dans une ténébreuse et profonde unité, vaste comme la nuit et comme la clarté, les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répondent. Il est des parfums frais comme des chairs d'enfants, doux comme les hautbois, verts comme les prairies, et d'autres corrompus, riches et triomphants, ayant l'expansion des choses infinies, comme l'ombre, le musc, le bonjour et l'encens, qui chantent les transports de l'esprit et des sens. Important to hear the poem in the original, I think, because the form of it famously enacts the point that Baudelaire is making. The poem develops as a series of quasi-synonyms for the idea of symbols: parole, écho, parfum, couleur, son. They all contribute to a synesthesia of meaning, a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk of comparison. Man, l'homme here, which is to say, of course, the poet, emerges not so much as in Shakespeare's example as truth's authentic author, but as sense's authentic author. reflecting Baudelaire's symbolist doctrine that would, of course, be so influential during the decades that followed and into the modernist period. And he does so, of course, through comparison, through analogies that are both syntactical, all those iterations of comme, and like, and, as I hope you heard when I read out the poem, onomatopeic, comme de longues échos qui de loin se confondent. The sound of the sentence enacts the very process of echoing that it's describing. Baudelaire creates meaning by comparing. Well, considered in this way, the term comparative literature takes on a different force. No longer a critical discipline after the fact, it becomes a creative enterprise in medias res. Literature of this sort, whether it's Goethean Bildung, Shakespearean similes, or Baudelairean correspondence, is both based on and also about comparison. I could go on adding examples, not least from, let's say, more minor writers, or indeed from female writers. But I wanted to choose canonical case studies to make the point clear. Literature itself is comparative. If we dial down our own methodological self-obsession, if we listen to what writers themselves are doing, we can hear that the comparisons are already there in the first place. Where then does this leave us? Well, if we consider the analogy implicit in the title of my lecture, the cause of the discontents of comparison become clearer. In Civilization and its Discontents, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, published in 1930, Sigmund Freud famously argued that civilization can only come at the cost of suppressing our selfish instincts. Civilization, to this extent, contains a vestige of bad conscience, the residue of personal affect that is not allowed to find fulfillment. Comparison, analogously, also, I think, contains a vestige of bad conscience, or so I've come to believe, since it's predicated on repressing something, namely the agency of the writer, who is now at our mercy, at the mercy of the critic. It is we, the critics, more often than not, who choose which text to compare. It is we, the critics, who decide, after the fact, which themes or patterns to draw out. Comparison will always have its discontents, not just because our perspective is necessarily predetermined, but also because it is post-determined by the very act of deciding who does or does not get to be compared. Comparative critics create their own frameworks, which are not necessarily those of comparative writers. So comparison's a paradigm, as I suggested in my first movement, and as such, it determines and distorts what we see. It's also a discourse, as I suggested in my second movement, one that tracks and responds to the aesthetic ideologies of the day. For comparison to be understood in a fuller sense, as I've just suggested in my third movement, we might usefully attend more closely, I think, to the practice of comparisons, to the comparisons that are already present in the texts and thinkers themselves, rather than simply perceiving and thus creating these meanings, these comparisons after the event. If we want to see the stars, we need to stop seeing stars in the sense this idiom has in English. We need to stop projecting and imagining things. Constellations, to adapt Walter Benjamin's famous image, are in the eye of the beholder. They do not exist independently. Apparently they don't exist on this screen either. The stars, however, are already up there in the sky, irrespective, there they are, of what we project onto them, irrespective of our theoretical maneuvers. The stars exist whether or not we create constellations in our minds. As we celebrate 20 years of your Lithuanian Comparative Literature Association, as we try to think about how European models of culture can relate to broader global models, I think we would do well to show this kind of cosmic humility before constructing our own comparative constellations. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. It was so rich and intensive that plenty. So I would like to open our discussion and invite our audience for questions and comments. Yeah, ready.
My question is about when Professor Kvietkauskas introduced you, he mentioned that among your interests is belated literary traditions. So my question is combining that direction with what you have been talking in this lecture, because belatedness is also something that I'm interested in. For example, when a genre already exists in those kind of Western traditions, right? And then other literary traditions only later adopt the genre. And could you please comment on this, whether such belated traditions are by definition comparative literature in this meaning, not as a method, but as material, because then this literature is created with the idea that, okay, our readers are probably already familiar with how the genre looks from those other traditions in the translation, and now we are creating something within the same narrative form, but in order to comment on our cultural moment.
Brilliant question. Thank you very much. Really good question. Really interesting question. And there's a very long answer that I could give. But the easiest thing I'd say probably is very annoyingly that I've written a book about this. So probably you should read the book rather than I sit here and paraphrase the book. But in short, yes, the reason it's a brilliant question is you bring together what I was talking about this evening with a whole other aspect of it, which is the nature of, let's say, tradition, different forms of genre, different forms of style, different forms of writing, different periods as belated because they're inherited by subsequent writers. And you're right to suggest that that is, in a way, and I think this is what you're saying, a form of what I was talking about this evening. So that comparison, when viewed as in my third movement, which is, of course, meant to be provocative to all of us, comparison emerges as something we could and perhaps should view from the point of view of the writers, a creative comparison, rather than, as we always impose it, critical comparison, because writers themselves, in picking up these various forms and genre and whatever they may be, they are themselves, of course, writing themselves comparatively into a tradition. Now, I could give you many, many examples of this. Perhaps I'll just take one, since I've been talking a little bit about Goethe, and stick with that period and the tradition. Immermann's book of 1836, I think it is, the Epigons, the Epigonen, all about the very idea. It is both an example of and about epigonality, about being belated, about coming late, and is typical of that whole German generation who felt they had come late after the death of Goethe and Hegel and various other major figures. And so that really overshadowed that whole period. And it led to this, an attempt to, let's just stay with that example, an attempt by Immermann to write himself into what I talked about briefly this evening, namely the Bildungsroman tradition. So he's trying to write a very long, typically digressive Bildungsroman, very much, I mean, too much really, in the Goethean style. It's painfully apparent. It's an example of epigonality in that sense too, more than Immermann perhaps wanted. It's an example of epigonality because it struggles to assert its own originality. It's too overshadowed by Goethe in that example. And one could take many, many other examples from many different traditions and periods. And I think one would have to think about the ways in which, I mean, one would have to do the work. I can give you, it's easy for me to give you a glib general answer, but I think one has to do the work of thinking about different periods and different writers, and of course, different linguistic traditions, and the different ways in which they inherit, the different belated ways in which they inherit these questions of form or genre or style. So I mentioned one example in the 1830s. One could think about later in the 19th century, the symbolists and decadents. I mentioned Baudelaire this evening. One could follow that tradition and see all these people who are writing in his lineage, and how they inherit his forms of symbolism and the way he understands the role of literature and poetry in creation. Equally, one could see this in the 20th century in various modernist forms. And then, of course, one could come back also on a kind of another broader meta level to the question of the relationship between the linguistic traditions themselves as different discursive blocks, and the extent to which different languages themselves see themselves or situate themselves within the context of other major languages, whether that's a language emerging within its own language, so to speak, as I mentioned at the start with Dante and the Italian emerging out of Latin, or whether that's within, let's just stay with Europe, within the European sphere, and different languages seeing themselves as in different parts of Europe. You know, we speak about Europe, but of course, what does that mean? It's such a big term with lots of different parts of Europe, says he, sitting here in Lithuania, having flown in from Paris. So the short answer to your question is, it is a brilliant question. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. These forms of belated inheritance are part of the story. The longer answer is, I think one has to do the work of situating those different forms in the different periods and the different times, which would give a much, much longer answer, which is essentially the book I wrote on that. I should say, incidentally, sorry, I'm just come to your question, that I'd be very interested to talk to you about this afterwards and to learn how you see this, and in particular, how you see this from, let's say, from a Lithuanian perspective. So I'm sure there are differences and things I could learn. Okay. While I think about that, can you just give me a couple of examples of the writers you're looking at, the English second language writers? Sure. Okay. Again, really interesting question. Thank you. I think so. For the sake of this lecture, I had two columns, and I took Jakobson's two terms, and I wanted to think about the differences between comparative and world literature. So it seems like I've said they're two separate things, and to an extent, they're two separate theories. But of course, they're also, one is part of another. I mean, just in purely in disciplinary university terms now, world literature is very much a part of the discipline of comparative literature, and it is pursued as such, and people write in and about world literature as part of comparative literature departments. So they're not separate things. In fact, in many ways, if you travel around the world and go to comparative literature workshops, more often than not, these days they're world literature. They're presented as world literature workshops. Partly, I think, because it's a way of, I think the emergence or the re-emergence of world literature around, let's say, the last 25, 30 years, lots of books been published, influential books been published on this, particularly in the US. And I guess it's partly a way of trying to get beyond the colonial paradigms of comparative literature. It's one of the reasons why world literature became the kind of cool, sexy thing, because it was a way of moving away from that, right? So interestingly, just a footnote on that, I do lots of these sorts of events, and what I notice is something that's really come to strike me is that world literature theory seems to be, for a generation of graduate students now, pretty much what post-structuralist theory was a generation ago. It's the kind of cool thing. And it's the space that people are working in. And that would have been, 30 years ago, that would have been in the 1990s, let's say, 80s, 90s, that would have been post-structuralism, deconstruction. So the point is, that's just an interesting observation, but the point is also that these theories change with time. There were fashions in the life of the mind, just like there were fashions in the life of clothes. To come to your question then, as I say, world literature is a part of comparative literature. So to that extent, I don't want to overstate. The difference I was making was historical, about the way they emerged as terms in the 19th century. Nowadays, they're pursued alongside each other. I think the example you give is a really interesting one of writers writing in their second or sometimes third language. Of course, that's always been an interesting aspect of comparative literature. And there's some you mentioned a couple of names, but also, of course, some very, very well-known writers who wrote in, I'll mention him because he's buried about 200 yards from my house. Joseph Conrad famously wrote in, what was it, his third language, English, third or fourth language, something like that. And Nabokov and so on and so on. You know all the names. All of that has always been a part of comparative literature. And I think again, it goes back to the point I've been trying to make about looking at the writers themselves. I mean, it's a very good example, in fact. I might steal it. It's a very good example of the point I'm trying to make, which is that we need to allow writers themselves to emerge as comparators. Because what are your examples? Your writers, what are they doing if not working as comparators, right? Through across languages. But they're doing it in a creative way, through writing poems, rather than in a critical way, coming to pre-existing texts and saying, I'm going to compare you with you, and I'm going to produce this third space, this insight, which is what we all do, professionally speaking, as comparatists. And I include myself in this very much. And this is why I have come to this view, because I worry that we impose ourselves too much sometimes on the texts. And I think the example you give is a very good way, in fact, of getting around that problem. So thank you for raising it.
Okay. Like make an intervention at this point. But when you speak about dangers of too much comparison, your question was, can we compare too much? Is a substance of the question. Is the feeling that always.
Interesting question. Yes, that's part. I mean, that's not in the first instance what I mean, actually. I could see how one might think that. So I can see why you're asking the question. And that clearly has to be part of the issue. But it's not in the first instance what I mean. What in the first instance, what I mean is really as a basic matter of epistemology, which is to say of the way we construct knowledge, right? And my worry is that in the discipline of comparative literature, we do that too much by imposing our frameworks, agonizing over all our different theories and methodologies, and comparing them, contrasting them, and then looking for ways to apply those theories to different texts. But a lot of that is about us. I mean, in a way, my anecdote about world literature theory now reminding me of post-structuralist theory 30 years ago, it kind of makes that point, which is, I think the reason all those theories were so successful back in the late 20th century. I mean, the overall reason, the main underlying reason, I think, is they flatter the critic. They make the critic think that I mean, the idea is as old as Romanticism. It goes back to someone I cited this evening, Friedrich Schlegel. Schlegel famously says something to the effect that the work of art requires criticism, requires the critic. Benjamin picks this up. The work of art can only be completed by the critic. It's an interesting idea, but it's also a profoundly narcissistic idea if you're a critic. And I think that was one of the main reasons for the success of much post-structuralist theory, is it made the critic think that the critic is no longer secondary. I mean, Derrida uses these terms. The critic is no longer secondary. The critic is now primary, because the critic has to complete the work of art and in some way co-create the work of art. And I think that's a danger I see with all theoretical models. And I worry sometimes, I'll just speak for myself, I worry sometimes that I get too much in the way of the texts when I'm comparing them, that I go to a text to come back to the first question, that I've decided I want to, like any project, I've decided I want to work on romantic modes of poetry. So therefore I go looking for the writers I want, and I choose the writers I'm going to compare, and I'm the person who decides what we're comparing. So I'm very much predetermining all of that. And that worries me. So to come back to your first, that's my main critique of our mode of comparison. However, you're not wrong. Of course, there's also a political substratum to all of this, because as I've said, and as we all know, comparative literature is extremely politicized historically and indeed now, in all sorts of ways, to do with whatever scale you take, to do with Europe, to do with colonialism, to do with imbalance in power structures. And indeed, if we were to do what I suggest, which is to look more closely at the writers themselves, that would be one way of obviating the problem of imposing politicized frameworks. So it's a very shrewd question, and it's part of it, but it's not actually the first thing I have in my mind.
I have another question.
Yeah.
How do you see the future of comparative literature?
So is your question, how do I see it, or how would I like to see it? Because they may not be the same thing, and it may not give you the answer you want, Carolina. So how I would like to see it, I think, is clear from what I've just said. I'd like a bit more critical humility from our part. Again, I'll just speak for myself, from my part. I think that will make space for, so I came up, I've been thinking this for the last couple of years, and I'll just say how I came up with it. I taught a class, I was visiting professor at the Sorbonne last year, and I taught a class, I was asked to teach a class, and I've been thinking about this for a while. So I taught a class all about, I called it Comparaison du côté des écrivains. So it was all about looking at a range of different writers, many, many more than I cited this evening, a range of different traditions, and looking at how they themselves compare, as I showed with my few examples this evening. And really fascinating conversations with the students along the lines of the conversation we've just started having, because they also brought their own ideas. It wasn't just about the writers I've said, look, let's look at this writer or that writer. They also then came to me and actually wrote their end of semester dissertations on a whole range of different writers, some of whom I didn't know, who themselves were functioning in interestingly comparative ways. And so they kind of got on board with this idea of not just imposing all the usual comparative theories we learn in graduate school and then apply. So that is one way in which I would like to see the discipline emerging, as well, developing. I'm not confident that it will, not least because we're all too invested. It's the point I was making about the theories and how they flatter the critic. We're all too invested in this. This is our, and I include myself. This is our discipline. This is our living. So we, in many ways, we need to continue doing things the way we're doing them, continuing to put ourselves in between the text as the critic, deciding the comparative framework. I think world literature, I mean, these kinds of theories are going to continue. That's what I see in, and people may have other views on this, but what I see when I go around to events on comparative literature is precisely these kinds of theoretical discussions. In some ways, ad nauseam, really, which is why I want to bring a slightly different perspective, because it tends to be the same comparisons, the same theories, because these are and this is then the capitalist critique, if you like, these are the dominant theories, which is to say largely North American theories, because they're the ones that dominate the market for all sorts of obvious reasons that go beyond the discipline of comparative literature. And those are the theories that get, ironically, to use David Damosh's term, those are the ones that receive circulation. He defines world literature as that which circulates. Of course, his theory has circulated, and others alongside it. And they're the ones that obtain a kind of market dominance and then get applied by graduate students and indeed by professors to various different unsuspecting texts. So I think that's going to continue. And I think probably I think there'll be more of that kind of critique of those, let's say, capitalist or even Marxist critiques of the dominant models of theory, of world literature theory, of comparative theory, of where they emerged from. And I think there needs to be a rebalancing. But of course, that's an easy thing to say. In practice, our field is, like everything else, really, beholden to forces, to much broader forces of globalization. Globalization wants to mean diversification, but in practice it means the opposite, of course. I mean, just read Erich Auerbach's essay on philology of world literature, 1952, written after he finished Mimesis. And what does he famously say in that essay, philology of world literature? It's as though someone asked him the question you asked me. He says, how will it develop? And his answer is, well, in fact, we want to think that things will open up and become more diverse and globalized, but the exact opposite will happen. Things will become much more monolithic. He was speaking as the Cold War was starting with the two blocks. And in terms of academic life, it's really a single block that dominates, isn't it? It's the Anglo-American world. I mean, that's why comparative literature should be such a wonderful thing, because it pushes against all those nationalism. The danger is that it then gets reduced again to certain predetermined national ways of seeing comparative literature. So those are the things, those are the concerns that I have when I observe the field. And that's how I think it will probably develop. Do you have a?
Yeah, I'll bring it.
Yes, my question is also related to the world literature and the fact that it became fashionable as a concept. So I just remember that in 2016, there was an article which discussed Chinese literature as world literature. And in 2017, there was a book on Romanian literature as world literature. So these are obviously different things that they mean by this, but I wonder if that is some sort of reaction to the world literature discourse, and also making us think that as each language has a certain claim to universality, so does each literary tradition. So isn't that the way to bring national traditions back into discussions?
Thank you. I think you've answered Carolina's question more eloquently than I did. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to say, essentially, that I think that's what's going to happen more and more, is that people are pushing back against this dominant Anglo-American definition of world literature as seen from the Ivy League, so to speak. And so I think we're going to have more of that. I think we're going to have more of, okay, what does world literature mean when seen from, I mean, of course, the Chinese model is the one that Goethe himself mentions when he's speaking to Eckermann, or Romanian, or whatever else it might be. And you're right, of course, it means different things, which is, I mentioned the idea of a Lithuanian comparative literature association as opposed to a British or French or German comparative literature association, which of course is already an interesting concept, and one could think about Lithuanian world literature, etc., etc. You could apply, we could start accruing adjectives, national adjectives, and then thinking about what it means. It's both logical and paradoxical, because, as I've said, the basic question is, do we have a universal? Should we have a universal model? There's the pathos of this idea that emerges out of the period of Schiller and Goethe, Schiller's idea of universelle Geschichte. Could we have a universal model of world history? If we could, it would probably mean what Auerbach foresaw as a flattening into the thing that dominates our world, which is English. If not, then we need to do the hard work, to come back to answer the first question, of separating all the different linguistic traditions and what they would mean. So what would it mean to have Chinese, Arabic, Romanian world literature, etc., etc.? And then, of course, once you've done all those individual studies, I'm thinking this is a kind of utopian project, you then have to bring them all back together. And that would then produce something closer to a genuine sense of world literature. I said earlier that we don't have a comparative history of comparative literature. That's kind of what I meant, or world history of world literature. Those are the kind of projects that I think are going to happen and are happening, as you rightly say. And I think those are the kind of big projects that can only be really written by a team of people who have bringing together lots of different linguistic expertise from different parts of the world. And that's the move. And another answer to your question, Carolina, about the development of the discipline. What's become clear, I think, is we're moving away from the idea of the nation or the nation state as the model or the unit for comparison, and moving towards languages themselves. I've seen lots of projects on this, lots of people trying to get away from this, what's seen essentially as a 19th century idea of the nation. I mean, I guess in European terms, it's 17th century, going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, and moving towards a more mobile, fluid sense of linguistic spaces, whether that is in post-colonial areas, Francophone, Africa, etc., or elsewhere. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of multilingual approach, which is also another way of answering your question. I think we are seeing, and we will continue to see, more of that kind of multilingual approach to comparison.
Thank you for your lecture. Really, it was very, very inspiring and thought-provoking. As a translator, I would like to ask about the role and about just where do you situate translation in the field of comparative studies? So this is one question. And another question I would ask as a literary scientists who compare Lithuanian and Latvian literatures, which are equal in size in essence. Do you see a problem, or I don't know, some inadequacy if you compare two literatures that are not equal in size, asymmetrical literatures?
Okay, thank you. So two related but separate questions, both very good and important questions. Translation clearly historically has been a key aspect of comparative literature, both conceptually but also institutionally. In translation studies, we talked about world literature as a part of comparative literature. Translation studies are also a disciplinary part of the institution of comparative literature, and rightly so. I mean, pragmatically speaking, we can't, I was going to say we can't teach, but in truth, it's more than that, because that implies the problems with the students. I as a professor, I can't think without, beyond a few languages that I can read. I need you. We need translators. We all need you. And even the most, I'm sure there are people in here who speak lots of languages, far more than I do, but even the most multilingual of us only speak a handful of languages. No one speaks all the languages. So we need translators. It's a pragmatic necessity. If we want to compare, they might be self-translators, or they might be people translating other people. Absolutely indispensable. And of course, that then becomes a question of how does that alter, how does the act of translation, it's a very old question, obviously, I don't talk to you about this, how does that alter the way in which we view the text? We're not seeing the same text, we're seeing a different text, we're seeing a version of the text. I think part of the answer to that then goes to your second question about the imbalances in power structures. So translating in what direction, from a so-called major language to a minor language, or in the other direction? What's the effect of that? I mean, I think we can't have enough translation, basically, because otherwise, how does any of us read any text? But of course, what one notices, we have to see the world as it is, not as we might like it to be. What one notices is that some cultures are much better, let's say, and translate much more than others. The obvious example is the Anglo-American world, which doesn't really translate. The numbers are tiny in terms of the percentage, the overall market publication. I forget the exact number, but it's a tiny, tiny number compared to my other half of me, so to speak, France. When they France, the numbers are much, much higher. They have a culture of translation. It's not a minor language, French, and the French are very offended if you would say that. Of course, a very high opinion, la grande nation. But nonetheless, they have a culture of, for other reasons too, they have a culture of taking translation very seriously and translating lots into the language. So that's an example of where even a very major world language has made space, continues to make space through various enlightened state policies, among other things, for translation and for bringing literatures from other languages into their cultural space. And equally, of course, I mean, the history of comparative literature shows us this. I mentioned Hugo Melzel, and there are other examples of how a good number of the ideas and impulses in the history of comparative literature, and some of the most interesting comparatists, have not come from the major languages or the major cultures. Why? Well, the answer is obvious, is because if you come from a so-called smaller country, smaller language, not so many people speak it, you have to learn the other languages if you want to open out to the world, right? I mean, am I telling you? You know this better than I do, I'm sure. But it's a kind of fact of the history of the discipline. If you look at the so-called margins of the smaller languages, many of the most interesting comparative figures have come from those countries because, Melzel, who speaks Hungarian? If you're not a native speaker, very few people are going to learn Hungarian. That's just a reality. So therefore, they become comparatists and pass through bigger languages. So there is a kind of, I mean, quite a lot of our discussion is circling around these issues of market forces historically in the 19th century and also now. And of course, now it's in some ways worse because of the dominance of a single language worldwide in terms of the market forces and in terms of the publishing world. But I mean, translators are utterly indispensable. It's just that they're not equally valued, I think, in all the cultures and languages.
Encourages wider recognition small languages, literatures, or is it ambiguous?
I think it's ambiguous. I think in theory it does. It's like I was saying earlier, in theory it does, but in practice, the large print giveth, the small print taketh away. In theory, yes, we want to be comparing lots of different languages, and people want to be as cosmopolitan as possible. But in practice, most people who have the time to learn languages, they don't, speak from my own experience, it's unlikely they're going to find or make the time. Of course, there are examples, but most people aren't going to learn smaller languages. They learn the bigger languages because that's the pragmatic reality of the world we live in. And I think there can sometimes be how to put this, I suppose, a kind of condescension towards smaller countries, smaller languages, and a kind of lip service, I guess that's the word, a lip service, paying lip service to the idea. But I mean, you'd have to tell me how that feels from your perspective. I can't tell you that, but I think I can't see that changing because of the way the world is. I mean, of course, political circumstances change, geopolitical circumstances change, and obviously with what's going on not far from here, people from the, let's say, Western Europe, the Anglo-American world, are certainly very interested in Eastern Europe and Eastern Northern Europe and what's going on here on the front, on the border with Russia and so on. Of course, they're interested, and of course, there's that sense of sympathy, pathos, call it what you will. But does that translate? How does that translate? Does that translate into a reality of people learning the languages, taking an interest in those cultures and histories beyond tiny amounts of specialists? I doubt so. So I think it is ambiguous.
Anybody else? Yeah, questions.
Well, I understand we're going to be having some supper afterwards, so I'm hoping whoever's coming to that, I'm going to be asking you lots of questions about how comparative literature looks from here in Lithuania, because that's the real reason. You know, I knew what I was going to say. I come to these things because I want to hear from you as well, and learn from you, and hear how things look from your point of view.
So, thank you very much again. It was a wonderful presentation, great discussion. And let's continue at thank you during dinner.
I was half expecting that. That was part of the provocation. I was going to say further, give many female examples too.